Squid Game. You know it, your cousin knows it, your uncle who thinks that feminism ended when women got pockets knows it, which, can I add, we still don't have pockets in all our clothing. Not as many pockets as men have, anyway, but I digress. When season 1 dropped in 2021, it didn't just break Netflix. It broke the illusion that you could ignore class struggle if the outfits were colour-coded. The show became a global phenomenon by being extremely unsubtle about the way that capitalism turns people into debt-ridden bloodsport contestants. And everyone loved it, partly because it was good, and partly because watching dystopia hit different when it had subtitles. Now fast forward to season 2 and the recent release of season 3, and amid the murder games, nihilism, and the hyper-saturated trauma, we meet Cho Hyun-ju, aka Player 120, a transgender woman, a former Special Forces soldier, and a character who joins the game to fund her gender-affirming surgery and escape a society that has thoroughly failed her. In South Korean TV, where trans actors and characters are almost non-existent, and when they do appear, they're often jokes or plot twists, this is, to put it gently, not normal. Hyun-ju is a rare inclusion, and more than that, she's treated with a surprising amount of respect. Her backstory is grounded in actual social issues, her gender identity isn't sensationalized, and she's never reduced to a punchline or a tragedy token. But, because, there's always a but, the role is played by Park Sung-hoon, a cisgender man. Which, does complicate things. It's not the worst casting in history, but it is part of a much bigger conversation about what we mean when we say representation and who gets to be visible in stories about marginalised people. Here's what we're unpacking today. Cho Hyun-ju is a meaningful step forward for trans visibility in Korean media, but her casting and the context around it raises necessary questions about authenticity, access, and whether inclusion on screen is enough when the people being represented are still erased behind the camera. Let's get into it. Cho Hyun-ju is a trans woman in Squid Game season 2 and 3. And for once, that sentence doesn't end with she's played for laughs, she's secretly a man, or she's dead within the first 5 minutes, which, unfortunately, is already revolutionary by TV standards. In the actual narrative, her gender identity is neither hidden nor sensationalized. She's not deceptive, she's not framed as dangerous, she's not the tragic cautionary tale, and she's definitely not comic relief. Even conversations about her history and her backstory are done with sensitivity. They're not intrusive, they're not exploiting the idea that she's trans. It's more about character development, and not just for her, but for the characters around her. For the most part, she's just there, living, speaking, competing, trying not to die, and trying to protect those that I believe she loves. Her backstory is rooted in real structural violence. She's discharged from the military after coming out, loses family support, and enters the game in hopes of affording gender-affirming surgery and starting over. It's bleak, but it's not excessive. The show treats these details as a part of who she is, not her whole identity. In media theory terms, she's not reduced to the trauma plot. Her pain has context, and more importantly, it has limits. But, and this is where it gets a bit complicated, Cho has quickly been embraced by the fandom. She's been called a diva, a queen, she's praised for her strength, her looks, her vibe, and that's lovely. Truly. But also worth asking, what kind of trans woman gets to be beloved? This is what some critics call the palatable trans trope. A figure who is exceptional, non-threatening, and neatly digestible for cisgender audiences. Think beautiful but not too bold, brave but not angry, feminine but not difficult. It's the kind of character who can be safely admired without challenging anyone's worldview too much. To quote Bell Hooks, because of course we're quoting Bell Hooks, this is a feminist theory channel after all. In Eating the Other, she writes about how marginalised identities are often made visible only when they can be consumed by dominant groups. Visibility, she says, doesn't necessarily equal liberation. It can just mean that you're marketable, tolerated, maybe even adored, as long as you don't make anyone too uncomfortable. So the question is, Does Cho Hyun-ju's character actually challenge dominant narratives about gender and trans identity, or does she slot neatly into what mainstream audiences find acceptable? Now let's address the cisgender elephant in the room. Cho Hyun-ju is played by Park Sung-hoon, a cis man. Now technically this isn't shocking. Cis men typically do play trans women. It's still widely common and usually defended with the same 3 talking points. It's just acting, we cast the best person for the role, and please don't yell on me on Twitter. Now as an actor, well, a past actor, I don't know, as someone that's had actor training, within acting theory there is this idea that on a ground level anybody should be able to play any character, because the intensive work that you do to get into character, to understand your character and to play your character effectively transcends any of these kind of physical boundaries, right? But you do have to acknowledge the backstory and the other societal impacts on what makes your character the character, such as their ethnicity, their gender, their sexual orientation, their religious standpoint, their political beliefs, all of that jazz, right? But as an actor, it's your job to be able to get into touch with those things. But when race, ethnicity, and maybe even gender is essential to the plot, does it not become offensive to then try to play that character if you are not of those identity, characteristics? There's not as much theory about this when coming to playing people of different genders, but there is extensive writing on ethnicity and colourblind casting. But in this case, the justification is a little more specific as to why a cisgender man is playing the role of a transgender woman. Squid Game creator Hwang Dong-hyuk has said that it was difficult to cast a trans actor in South Korea because of how marginalised trans people are, socially, politically, and professionally in the country. And he's not wrong. There's no real infrastructure to support trans performers in Korea. They're barely visible in media, they're often barred from jobs, and face widespread public stigma. The talent is out there, but the access is not. So okay, maybe casting Park Sung-hoon was logistically understandable, but was it ethically the right choice? Park did reportedly prepare by consulting trans people, working towards stereotypes, and taking the role seriously, which when I talked about getting into character, that makes sense. You do have to do that kind of research, which, in fairness, is more than most actors that are playing trans characters do. The performance itself is restrained, grounded, and free of caricature, which is the main issue that a lot of people pick when it comes to colourblind casting and playing roles where gender or ethnicity is key to the plot. But it's still part of a larger pattern. As Jen Richards explains in the documentary Disclosure, when cis men play trans women, even respectfully, it reinforces a deeply damaging cultural myth that trans women are really men, that femininity is a costume, and that gender is something that you put on, not something that you are. Now, if you're a fan of this channel, you might be asking, Leah, don't you often reference Butler's theory of gender performativity? Are you not contradicting yourself here? If you read Judith Butler, and let's be honest, some of you may have skimmed it or just heard it from my videos, you might be tempted to jump in here and say, but gender is a performance, right? So why can't we perform it as actors? And yes, but no. But yes, just let me explain. In Gender Trouble, Butler argues that gender isn't a fixed identity or an internal essence. It's something we do, a series of acts, gestures, repetitions, which over time create the illusion of a stable gendered self. That doesn't mean that gender is fake, or that anyone can just put it on like drag. That's not performance as in theatre performance or acting performance. It's performativity as in social conditioning with consequences. So when a cis man plays a trans woman on screen, what is happening isn't just a performance of femininity. It's a recasting of trans womanhood as something that's always secretly belonged to cis men. It makes trans identity legible only when filtered through cis embodiment. And that's where Butler's theory can get a bit distorted. Gender is performative, yes, but performances are constrained by social norms. Not everyone gets the same stage, the same script, or the same audience. So let's not confuse Butler's critique of gender essentialism with a free pass for casting men as women because it's all drag anyway. It's not. One is a structural analysis of identity and the other is just bad casting dressed up in theory. And the issue is when those performances are the only representations that people see, it bleeds into real-world violence. It tells viewers that transness is artificial, that being cis is the default body behind the role. Which brings us to more casting theory, because yes, I've got to go there. I've got to put my drama degree to use, okay guys? Theatre scholar Erica Fisher-Litch writes that performance is never neutral. It's always embodied. The actor brings their body, their history, and their social meanings to the role. So when a cis man plays a trans woman, he doesn't just pretend to be her. He frames her, and that framing carries power. Similarly, P. David Marshall's persona theory reminds us that casting is a kind of cultural messaging. The actor isn't just performing gender, he's reinscribing it. So then, should underrepresented identities only be played by those who live them? It's a valid question, and one that's often met with defensive shrugs. You know, it's called acting, we cast for skill. Should gay people only play gay roles? You know the drill. But the reality is that trans actors rarely get any roles, not even the roles written about them. So the issue isn't just identity matching, it's about access, labour, and justice. And here's the real kicker. When a trans role is played by a cis actor, it means the character is present, but trans people still aren't. That's representation without redistribution, visibility without equity. You get the optics and none of the investment. So yeah, Cho Hyun-ju is on screen and that's great, but trans women are still not in the room where it happens. Do you see what I did there? You know, I added a musical quote in because we were talking about acting. Oh, I love being a drama nerd. So, casting matters. And when it comes to trans roles, casting matters even more. Not because trans actors are inherently more authentic or more talented, but because they've historically been shut out of the industry almost entirely. Globally, trans actors face some of the highest rates of unemployment in entertainment, along with misgendering, typecasting, and outright exclusion from roles. Even ones written explicitly about being trans. That's not about merit, that's about access. So when a trans character like Cho Hyun-ju comes along, rare, narratively serious, and culturally visible, the casting choice becomes more than just a creative decision. It becomes a question about who gets the opportunity to tell their own story, and who continues to be left out of the room. This is where Sara Ahmed's concept of non-performative diversity comes in. In On Being Included, she defines it as diversity that gets named, displayed, or applauded, but doesn't actually redistribute power or challenge structures. You know the type, the "we care about inclusion" statement followed by a boardroom full of the same people as last year, often dominated by the same skin colour and gender. Casting a cis actor in a trans role, especially when trans actors are already marginalised, risks falling into that category. Visibility without opportunity. Inclusion that flatters the institution without empowering the people it claims to represent. And this isn't just theoretical, we've seen this debate play out across projects. The Danish Girl and Transparent, both with cis men playing trans women, sparked backlash despite critical acclaim, and Eddie Redmayne actually said he probably wouldn't do that role again now he understands the context and the power behind being casted in that role. Pose, by contrast, casted trans women as trans women, which changed lives, careers, and whole trajectories. Joyland, a Pakistani film about trans women, was praised internationally and broke ground by involving trans creatives both on and off screen. So we ask, is representation meaningful if it doesn't come with trans creative labour behind the camera, or long-term visibility for trans performers if it centres the character but sidelines the community? But, and this is not a minor but, we also need to acknowledge context. As I've already said, South Korea is not Hollywood. The country has no anti-discrimination laws covering gender identity. Trans people face intense stigma, surveillance, and career loss simply for coming out. There are few, if any, major Korean actors who are openly trans because being openly trans in public life carries enormous personal risks. So in this way, even if there were trans actors available, would putting them on the platform and basically exposing them to the world and Korea as trans actually cause more harm to that individual actor than career success? But it's tempting to look at Hollywood and think, well, they did it, right? So why can't Korea? But let's be real, guys. Even in the West, the backlash is intensifying. Unfortunately, trans people in the US and the UK are facing growing legal restrictions. Actors like Hunter Schafer are seen as brave exceptions, but not the norm. Even non-binary or gender non-conforming celebs like Sam Smith or Chappell Roan face a constant wave of vitriol for existing too visibly. But and here's the difference, they still exist in the spotlight. So while Hollywood is far from a utopia, especially for trans people and LGBTQI+ individuals, it has at least cracked the door open for trans and gender diverse creatives to come through. South Korea hasn't even installed the door yet. So when we talk about Cho Hyun-ju's casting, we have to hold both truths. That the choice to cast a cis man in a trans role is ethically loaded, but in this context, casting a trans woman might not have been safe, sustainable, or even possible. Still, we can't let that reality become a permanent excuse. Visibility under violent conditions isn't justice, but neither is erasure dressed as protection. The real work is making sure that the next trans Korean character isn't so exceptional, and that when she appears, she's played by someone who didn't have to gamble their life to get there. So when the creator of Squid Game says he struggled to find a trans actress for Cho's role, it may not have been a deflection, it may have been reality. For many trans actors in Korea, playing a trans character on this scale could be professionally or personally unsafe. Which brings us to a difficult intersection. How do you fight for authentic casting when the society itself punishes authenticity? Is it better to cast a cis actor who can safely play the role, or wait until it's possible to cast someone who can live the role without fear of social ruin? And is this representation good anyway, regardless of the casting behind the role? This doesn't mean that we stop asking for better though. However, it does mean that we ask with nuance, because representation without redistribution is hollow, but representation that endangers the people it aims to uplift isn't liberation either. It's just another game with rigged rules. So when the second season of Squid Game dropped, Cho Hyun-ju became a crowned fan favourite. Twitter called her mother, TikTok labelled her a diva, and K-drama stans stitched together compilations of her best moments like she was a pop star on tour, not a contestant in a dystopian death game. There's something genuinely moving about that though. A trans character in Korean mainstream media being loved, not for tragedy, but for power, poise, and personality. So let's be clear, as much as I don't really like stans and the idea of stanning people, fandom is really important. Henry Jenkins' theory of participatory culture reminds us that fans don't just consume media, they reshape it, remix it, and reclaim it. For queer and trans viewers especially, fandoms can be a site of affirmation when institutions such as schools, governments, and Netflix executives fall short. But love from the audience doesn't always mean love from the system. We've seen this before. A marginalised character is adored online, becomes a meme, maybe even sells a Funko Pop, but behind the scenes there's no change to who gets cast, who gets paid, or who gets to create. Cho's narrative does feel like progress. She's strong, kind, clever, and not reduced to her trauma, but that representation, no matter how well intentioned, still sits atop an industry where trans creatives remain almost entirely absent. We have to ask, Is that validation or just symbolic inclusion? The kind that looks like progress but leaves the power structures untouched. You know, it's something to be happy about, but is it really that groundbreaking? This leads us to a critical and, kind of awkward question. Does the affection of the audience and the nuance of Cho's story mitigate the casting of a cis man in the role? Or, and stay with me here, does it show how low the bar still is? That in 2025, we're still whispering things like, well, at least they didn't make her the punchline. Like, it's a revolutionary win? Fandom love is not unimportant, but if it isn't paired with industry access, with safety, and with actual roles for trans actors, it risks becoming just another band-aid. And trans people don't need any more band-aids. They need contracts, residuals, health insurance, and the right to play themselves in media, the right to be represented by the people that actually live their lives. So to conclude, Cho Hyun-ju is without question a landmark. She's complex, she's brave, she's resourceful, and let's be honest, she's a fucking icon. Her presence in Squid Game marks a shift in what's possible for trans representation in Korean mainstream media. She's not a joke, she's not a tragedy, she's not a warning sign, she's a player in the game and in the narrative. But while the character does break ground, and it's really important that we take that win, the casting doesn't. Park Sung-hoon's portrayal, though researched and very respectfully done, is still part of a long global tradition where cis actors are trusted with trans roles, but trans actors aren't trusted with careers. And this is where we return to the bigger picture. Representation is not the same as inclusion. A trans character on screen isn't meaningful if it doesn't translate into actual access for trans actors and trans people off screen. To move beyond tokenism, we still need equity in authorship, in casting, in creative control. Visibility without opportunity is just another form of erasure. So yes, Squid Game does get points for including Cho, but the real game is what happens next. Will Korean media and global entertainment more broadly finally make room for trans storytellers to tell their own stories? Or will it keep applauding inclusion that doesn't redistribute power? Because trans people deserve more than just roles. They deserve a seat at the writer's table, a name in the credits, and a world that stops treating their lives like plot devices. But hey, that's just my opinion. Let me know what you think down below. And if you are bigoted and transphobic, you will be removed. Thank you for watching this video. If you did enjoy it, leave a like and subscribe if you're new. Please consider becoming a member today for access to all my sources and other bits and bobs under the membership tab. I will link it down below. Also, for any of you that like cute animals, I have recently made a TikTok for my kitten. If you would like to see that, I've also put her out in the description as well. And with that, I'll see you soon.